understand. Now, when did the first edition of the Whisky Bible come out?
Well, that wasn't until 2004.
2004, okay.
Yeah, I mean, well, it came out in 2003, but it was the 2004 edition. But by that time, I'd already written about 6, 7, loads of books, you know, that had sold probably the best part of 500,000 copies. So I'd already done a huge amount of work already. I did a book called Jim Murray's Complete Book of Whiskey, which came out in 1997. That sold, I don't know, 300,000 or something. And I invested £50,000 of my own money to go to every distillery that there was. That was back in the 90s. I mean, it was a huge amount of money. It was a real gamble to do that. And so at that stage, you could do that. You could, not that people were, but you could go to every single distillery.
I understand.
You can't do that now.
I mean, well, whiskey's gone global, right? So since then,
there's a new distillery opening up every week somewhere, or every day probably. You know, I've just come out to the United States. There's a new distillery in the United States opening up every week, let alone the rest of the world. And you've got Europe, you've got India opening up, you've got Australia opening. You know, now none of these places were whiskey producers. America obviously, but you know. The understanding of actually producing whiskey in hot climates has changed dramatically, and so now there's far more confidence in the ability to produce high grade whiskey in those countries than there was years ago. But going back to 1992, there wasn't even belief in some of the industries themselves. I mean, in 1992, Scotland was still a pretty nervous place about whiskey because during the 80s they'd had a thing called the whiskey law, where they'd overproduced and distilleries closed down.
That was the whiskey equivalent of the wine lake, right?
Exactly.
The same thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And so none of the distillers had fantastic confidence. You know, they'd been through the pain barrier once too often. And when I first went to Kentucky in the early 80s, about 93, 94, there was absolutely disbelief, almost ridicule, when I said to them, rye be taken off, bourbon will take off, because they were having problems letting just keeping the markets that they had. You know, I remember a distiller in Kentucky saying, well, you know, every time you read the obituary, whoever dies, that's another one of your customers gone, and no one's going to replace them, because it was regarded as an old man's drink. And so when I told them, look, there's a revolution on its way, you guys, you got good times ahead. I mean, I remember one guy just laughing. You know, he said, God, if only you were right. And there has been. And for me to see all this is just wonderful, because I knew a lot of people who despaired, 27 years ago. Yeah. They really, really did. And you know, if I'm doing a whiskey tasting, or I'm travelling around the world, and I see someone taste an Ardbeg, for instance, and that was a distillery that I actually saved from demolition, I get a little, feeling, yes, what I've been doing is worth something.
Yes, yeah, I can see.
I mean, I'm doing a tasting tonight, and I'm talking about Penderyn. I'm talking about Welsh whiskey. Now, if in 1992 you say, well, actually, there's going to be Welsh whiskey, they're just looking and saying, what the hell are you talking about? But now there's Penderyn, there's distilleries in England, and these are really high quality, top quality whiskies, world class whiskies, produced in these places that in 1992 was only a dream. And now you go to Kentucky, and tourists are pouring into the place where once, you were more likely to see tumbleweed across the
distillery. It's kind of a destitute industry, yes.
Than you were. Everything has changed dramatically.
And you cover it so wonderfully in your Whisky Bible. When is the next edition due out?
I'm working on it now. It's out in October.
Out in October, okay.
Yeah.
So I guess you're a busy man these days.
I have to taste, on average, about 1,250 new whiskies.
Right.
But as well as that, I do consultancy. I do my shows around the world. I have plenty to occupy me. Put it that way. Let's just say, I'm 27 years older now than I was back in 1992. But it seems I'm 27 times busier because I literally don't get a day to myself. It's really just whizzing around, and to see people discover these whiskies compared to the gloom that there used to be and the joy that there now is.
Right.
I just think it's wonderful, but that doesn't mean to say that all whiskies are great, because there's not. And one of the things that I will always do, I'm always going to upset people, because if I think a whiskey is substandard, for whatever reason, for the way it's been distilled, more likely because of the way it's been matured, I will say so.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, as I say, I am there for the consumer, and people now are paying a lot of money to buy their whiskey, and I don't believe that they should be buying substandard. So I and the Whisky Bible will always kick, but always try and be kind when possible and encourage when possible. But I don't think there's any room to just say, oh yeah, it's not very good, but drink it anyway. There's no saying there's no such thing as a bad whiskey. Well, there is, and the whole point of the Bible is to keep people away from it.
Excellent. That's an admirable stance to have. Jim, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to spend some time with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Bye for now.
Bye.